The earth turned easy, like it knew what he was about to do. Like the rust-red dirt and fractured stone of the Grieve had been waiting for this offering, this final admission. Marston Keel's hands, calloused from mending wire and hauling water, felt clumsy on the spade's familiar wood. The weight of it was nothing, but the weight of the thing wrapped in oilskin, tucked inside his worn canvas coat, was an anchor pulling his soul down through the soles of his boots. He worked under a sliver of moon, a sickle of bone in a bruised sky. No sound but his own breathing, a ragged rhythm against the desert's immense listening silence. The air smelled of dust and creosote and the coming chill, the scent of a land that had long ago forgotten rain. He had chosen the spot with care, a shallow basin shielded by a knot of skeletal mesquite, far enough from the ranch house that old Hesh wouldn't stumble upon it, close enough that he could feel its absence from his cabin. A grave for a memory. He had carried it for 6 years. 6 years of watching his own face become a stranger's in murky water troughs, of feeling for the hilt that was no longer at his hip. The knife. A vexillator's shard, they'd called it. Forged in the synod's geothermal vents, quenched in the waters of a sanctified spring, its edge honed to a whisper. It was designed not just to cut flesh, but to sever a soul from its history, from its kith. That's what the scriveners of the unwritten law preached. A mercy killing, to free the spirit from heretical soil. Marston had believed it, once. He had held the shard aloft in the flickering light of the purification, his faceplate hot from the burning thatch of the canyon dwellings, and he had believed the litany he chanted. He believed it right up until the moment the shard slid between the ribs of a man who looked at him not with fear, not with hate, but with a profound and weary pity. The man had been a weaver, his hands stained with indigo and cochineal, not a warrior. He had been holding a small wooden bird, half-carved. That was the memory. The splintering of the tiny bird as the man's hands spasmed, the whisper of the man's name on his own lips, an involuntary prayer of sacrilege. Rorik. Now, the hole was deep enough, almost to his knee. The dirt piled beside it was a dark lung exhaled from the earth. Marston pulled the oilskin package from his coat. It was heavy, dense with purpose. He unwrapped it slowly. The shard didn't gleam in the faint moonlight. Its metal was matte black, designed to drink the light and give nothing back. The hilt was wrapped in cured strips of what he now knew was human skin. He had held it with a gauntlet then. Now his bare fingers traced the braided leather, and a tremor ran up his arm, a phantom echo of the life it had taken. He was just a ranch hand. He mended things. He didn't break them anymore. This was the last piece of that other life, the last tooth of the beast. He would bury it. He would fill the hole. He would walk away and let the desert swallow the evidence that Marston Keel, the vexillator, had ever existed. He knelt, holding the shard over the dark rectangle of the grave. He would not say a prayer. He had no God left to pray to, and the earth here was not his own. He simply meant to drop it, to let it fall from his life. He let go. But the sound was wrong. Not the solid thud of metal on packed dirt, not the scrape of steel against stone. It was a dull, soft impact, followed by a puff of air, a moan so faint it was almost indistinguishable from the wind sighing through the mesquite. Marston froze, his hand still open, suspended over the hole. He had heard it. He was not a man given to fancies. The Grieve was a harsh, empty place, but it was not haunted, not by things that made such a sound. He stared into the darkness of the pit. Nothing. A trick of the wind. An animal. He was overwrought. He reached for the spade to begin filling the hole, to cover the shard and the sound and the last 6 years of his life. Then the sound came again, clearer this time. A whimper. A child's whimper. And the surface of the hole's bottom, a dark blanket of what he'd taken for loose soil and fallen leaves, stirred. A cold that had nothing to do with the night air seized him. It was a coldness that bloomed from his gut, ancient and absolute. He dropped to his knees at the edge of the hole, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He squinted, his eyes struggling to adjust. The shape was there. A small, humped form, curled in on itself like a snail in its shell. A scattering of dry leaves and twigs lay across it like a burial shroud. He could see the pale smudge of a hand, a tiny fist clutching a fold of rough-spun cloth. Breath and bone. The spade had hit breath and bone. His mind refused it. A coyote pup, a sick javelina, anything but what his senses screamed at him. He slid, half falling, into the shallow grave. The shard lay beside the small form, its dark metal a sliver of condensed night. Marston ignored it. He reached out a trembling hand, the hand that had just held the knife, and brushed away the leaves. The form was a child, impossibly small. A thatch of dark, matted hair, a face pale with dust and sleep, cheek pressed into the cold earth. They were wrapped in a tattered blanket the color of dried mud. As his fingers touched their shoulder, the child flinched, a current of life passing through them. Their eyes fluttered open. In the star-dusted dark, they were huge black pools of bewilderment. They stared up at him, at the hulking shape of the man looming over them in their earthen bed. There was no fear in their gaze, only a deep, quiet recognition, as if they had been waiting. A tiny, dusty voice, cracked with sleep and thirst, whispered a single word. Marston. The name struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was not the formal, clipped address of the Synod, nor the grunted acknowledgement of Hesh. It was spoken softly, an old familiarity, a sound he had not heard in a lifetime. No one in this forsaken land knew that name. He was Keel here. Just Keel. He stared, unable to speak, unable to move. The desert, which had felt so empty moments before, now felt crowded, packed with unseen witnesses. The wind whispered through the mesquite, and this time it sounded like voices, like the ghosts of a language he had tried to forget. The child's eyes remained fixed on his. They did not blink. They were impossibly old eyes in a face no older than 7 summers. The cold in his gut tightened into a knot of pure dread. This was not a rescue. This was a summoning. The grave he had dug for his past had yielded up a living piece of it. He couldn't leave them here. Whatever this was, whatever curse or judgment had been laid upon him, he could not leave a child to die in a hole in the ground. The thought was automatic, instinctual, a relic of a man he barely remembered being. He reached down, his large, rough hands sliding beneath the small, frail body. The child was lighter than a sack of feed, a bundle of twigs and warm breath. They made no protest as he lifted them. Their head lolled against his shoulder, their gaze still on his face, watchful. He gathered the tattered blanket around them, his movements stiff and unpracticed. As he stood, his boot nudged the shard. He looked down at it, lying there in the dirt like a dark, accusing finger. He left it there. He climbed out of the hole, the child held tight against his chest. Their breath was a warm puff against his neck, a fragile counterpoint to the howling emptiness inside him. He turned and started the walk back toward the faint, solitary light of his cabin, leaving the grave open behind him, a gaping mouth in the desert floor, waiting. He could feel its darkness at his back, a cold pressure, all the way home. The cabin was a single room, smelling of wood smoke, sweat, and cheap tallow. A narrow cot, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a cold iron stove. His life had been pared down to these few things, an asceticism of guilt. He laid the child on his cot, the only soft place in the room. The scratchy wool of his own blanket felt impossibly coarse against the child's dusty skin. In the dim light of the single lantern he lit, he saw them clearly for the first time. He couldn't tell if they were a boy or a girl. Their face was thin, all sharp angles and hollows, smudged with dirt that seemed ground into the pores. Their hair was black and lank, tangled with bits of leaves and burrs. They wore a simple, sleeveless tunic of undyed homespun, torn at the hem. They were shivering, a fine, continuous tremor that shook their small frame. He moved to the stove, his actions mechanical. He coaxed a flame from the embers, added kindling, then larger pieces of mesquite. He filled a pot with water from the barrel by the door, his hands shaking so badly he spilled a measure of it on the floor. While the water heated, he found a clean rag, one he used for polishing Hesh's tack. He dipped it in the bucket of clean water and knelt by the cot. "I'm going to clean your face," he said. His voice was a rusty hinge. The child didn't answer. They just watched him with those unsettlingly calm eyes. He wiped the dirt away gently. The skin beneath was pale, a fine scar, white and old, cut through one eyebrow. As the grime came away, their features became clearer, a small, straight nose, a mouth that seemed set in a permanent line of solemnity. He cleaned their hands, the small fingers uncurling as he wiped the palms. There were calluses there, the kind a child gets from work, not play. When the water on the stove was warm, he poured some into a bowl, found a bit of lye soap, and brought it back to the cot. He washed their feet, the dirt coming away in muddy streaks. Underneath, the soles were tough, but cut and bruised in a dozen places. How far had they walked to find that specific spot? How long had they been sleeping in that hole? The questions were a swarm of hornets in his head. He found an old, soft shirt of his own and helped the child out of their torn tunic and into it. It swallowed them, the sleeves hanging a foot past their fingertips, the hem pooling around their ankles. They looked like a ghost haunting his clothes. He sat them up and held a cup of warm water to their lips. They drank, slowly at first, then greedily, their small hands coming up to clutch the tin cup. Some of it dribbled down their chin, and he wiped it away with his thumb. The contact was electric. He hadn't touched another human being with any kind of gentleness in 6 years. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low, trying to keep the tremor out of it. "What's your name?" The child lowered the cup, their dark eyes meeting his. They swallowed. "Cinder," they said. The name was a puff of smoke. "Cinder," he repeated. It felt like ash in his mouth. "How did you know my name?" The child, Cinder, simply stared at him. The lantern light flickered, casting shadows that danced in the corners of the room, making the familiar space feel alien. Cinder's gaze shifted from his face to a point over his shoulder, toward the small, grimy window that looked out onto the Grieve, out toward the open hole. "The earth told me," Cinder said, their voice a flat, factual whisper. And then they laid their head back on his lumpy pillow, turned their face to the wall, and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. Marston sat on the floor by the cot for hours, watching the child breathe. The rise and fall of their small chest under his enormous shirt was the only movement in the room. The fire in the stove crackled and died down. The desert outside grew colder, more silent. He felt trapped, pinned in place by the child's presence. The earth told me. What did that mean? Was the child delirious? Touched by the sun? Or was it something else? Something from the old ways, the kith beliefs he had once been sent to extinguish. They believed the land held memory, that the dust of their ancestors whispered truths to those who knew how to listen. He had burned their scripture scrolls, pulled down their whisper reeds, shattered their story stones. He had called it superstition. He got up and walked to the window. The moon was higher now, casting a sterile silver light across the landscape. He could see it from here. A small black rectangle in the gray dirt. The hole. It looked like a wound he had opened, and out of it had bled this small, inexplicable piece of his past. He thought of the shard lying at the bottom, an offering rejected. The earth didn't want the knife. It had given him something else in exchange. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hole, and he saw the child's face, those ancient eyes. He saw the weaver, Rorik, falling, the little wooden bird crushed in his fist. The images braided together, a cord of guilt and dread tightening around his throat. He spent the night in the chair, watching, waiting. For what? He did not know. For the child to wake up and explain the impossible. For Hesh to knock on his door at dawn. For the whole world to crack open and swallow him whole. The first dream came just before dawn, in that gray, liminal hour when the world is not yet awake. He wasn't asleep, not truly, just slumped in the chair, his head lolling against the rough wood of the wall. But the cabin faded, and the smell of creosote was replaced by the thick, acrid scent of burning pitch pine, and something else, something sweet and terrible, the smell of roasted meat. He was standing in firelight, the heat searing his face even through the steel of his vexillator's helm. The air was full of screaming, not the sharp, clean screams of battle, but the ragged, tearing wails of anguish. He saw the Kith's canyon dwelling, the one they called Salt Ash Hollow, turned into a furnace. The woven tapestries that depicted their histories were curling into black, fiery tongues. He saw the faces of his brothers in the synod, their expressions ecstatic, beatific, their eyes reflecting the flames. The Scrivener Prime was chanting the litany of unburdening, his voice a hammer against the anvil of the chaos. Marston's gauntleted hands were slick. He looked down. He was holding the shard. Its black metal seemed to hum with the heat and the violence. Before him stood a woman, her face streaked with soot, her long, dark hair singed at the ends. She held a child in her arms, a small bundle wrapped in a blanket the color of mud. She wasn't pleading. She was just looking at him, her eyes burning with a fire hotter than the one that consumed her home. She said something. He couldn't hear it over the roar, but he could read her lips. A name. Not his name. Another name. Then his gaze was drawn past her, to a man trying to scramble up the canyon wall. A weaver, his hands stained blue. Rorik. An order was given, a shout from one of his comrades. No witnesses. Unburden them all. And Marston moved, the litany a dead thing on his tongue, the shard an extension of a will that was not his own. He felt the sickening give of flesh, saw the surprise and the pity in the weaver's eyes. He saw the small wooden bird fall. And then he saw the woman again, the one with the child. She was still looking at him, and as Rorik fell, her expression didn't change. She just held the child tighter and whispered something into the bundle. A name. He woke with a gasp, the wooden chair digging into his spine. The cabin was cold. The sun was a pale smear on the horizon. His heart was hammering, a wild bird trapped in his chest. He was slick with a sweat that had nothing to do with heat. The dream had been more vivid, more complete, than any memory he'd allowed himself in 6 years. It was the child. Their presence in the room had unlocked something in him, pried open a door he had nailed shut, and tried to forget existed. He looked over at the cot. Cinder was awake. They were sitting up, his big shirt pooled around them, watching him. Their expression was unreadable. "You dream loud," Cinder said. Marston couldn't answer. He felt flayed open, his guilt a raw, exposed nerve. Hesh arrived on his mule an hour later, as he always did, to outline the day's work. Marston met him outside, closing the cabin door carefully behind him. He needed to keep the child hidden. He didn't know why, only that their existence was a secret between him and the desert. "You look like hell, Keel," Hesh grunted. The old man's face was a road map of wrinkles, his eyes small and shrewd. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Marston's boot. "Ghosts ride you last night?" "Something like that," Marston said, his voice hoarse. "Well, let 'em ride. That section of fence down by the dry wash ain't gonna fix itself. Posts are rotten. Take the wagon, haul some new ones from the stack." Marston nodded, his eyes instinctively drifting past Hesh's shoulder, toward the basin of mesquite, toward the hole. Hesh followed his gaze. "What you looking at? See a stray?" "No, nothing." Hesh squinted, his gaze lingering on the spot. Something's different. Don't know what. The land, it feels different today, like it's holding its breath. He shrugged, the observation passing. Get to it. Hesh rode off, leaving Marston alone with the morning and the secret in his cabin. He worked all day in a fugue state. The familiar motions, lifting the heavy cedar posts, digging the holes, tamping the earth, stretching the wire taut with the creaking tensioner, were the only things that kept him tethered to reality. The sun beat down, the heat relentless. The grieve shimmered. But all he could see was the open grave. All he could feel was the weight of the child. All he could hear was the whisper of their name. Cinder. Ash. The remnant of a fire. He had to get food for them. He couldn't share his own meager rations of salted meat and hardtack for long. When he finished the fence line, he rode the wagon further than he needed to the edge of Hesh's property, where the wild gourds sometimes grew. He found a few, small and green, and a patch of prickly pear, and carefully burned the spines off the pads before wrapping them in a scrap of canvas. It wasn't much. When he returned to the cabin at dusk, exhausted and covered in a film of sweat and dust, the door was slightly ajar. Panic flared in his chest. He pushed it open. The room was empty. The cot was bare, his shirt folded neatly on the pillow. The child was gone. For a moment, a wild, irrational relief washed over him. It had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by guilt and sunstroke. There was no child. There was no one who knew his name. Then he saw them. Cinder was standing at the far side of the room, by the small collection of his personal things on a crude shelf. In their hands, they held the object he treasured most, the only thing he had kept from his life before the synod. It was a smooth, flat river stone, worn gray by time and water. His mother had given it to him when he was a boy, before he'd been taken as a synod novitiate. She'd told him it was a listening stone, that if he held it to his ear, he could hear the voice of the river it came from. He hadn't heard the river in 20 years. Cinder was holding the stone to their ear, their expression one of intense concentration. They looked up as he entered, their eyes wide. "It's sad," they whispered. "What is?" Marston asked, his voice gentle. "The stone. It's crying." Marston walked over and knelt in front of them. He didn't know what to say. He had forgotten the stone was even there. He had certainly never tried to listen to it. He had been too afraid of what it might say. Cinder held the stone out to him in their small, upturned palms. An offering. He took it. The stone was warm from their touch. "I brought you some food," he said, changing the subject. He cooked the gourd and cactus pads on the stove, cutting them into small, manageable pieces. Cinder ate with a slow, deliberate seriousness, as if it were a ritual. They didn't speak again until the last piece was gone. Marston watched them, a knot of questions tightening in his throat. Who were they? Where were their parents? How did they end up in that hole? He was afraid of the answers. He was terrified that the truth would be something he couldn't bear. That night, he gave Cinder the cot again. He laid a pallet of empty grain sacks for himself on the floor, the cold seeping up through them into his bones. He lay awake, listening to the child's soft breathing. And he listened to the silence of the desert, a silence that no longer felt empty, but full of a terrible waiting patience. The dream came again. Hotter this time, louder. The screams had names. He could hear the crackle of the looms as they burned, the shattering of the clay pots filled with dye. He was closer to the woman with the child. He could see the intricate embroidery on her collar, a pattern of silver moths. He could smell the scent of her hair, something like lavender and wood smoke. She was looking past him at the weaver, Rorik. And when Rorik fell, a single tear cut a clean path through the soot on her cheek. She didn't make a sound. She just bent her head and whispered into the blanket that held her child. She whispered a promise. The earth will remember. The stone will cry. The cinder will speak his name. Marston woke up with a strangled cry, his hands clenched into fists. He was on the floor of his cabin, the grain sacks twisted around him. The dream clung to him like smoke. The cinder will speak his name. He sat up, his body trembling. He looked at the cot. Cinder was sitting up too, their small silhouette outlined against the gray pre-dawn light from the window. They were not looking at him. They were looking at the door. "He's coming," Cinder said. Marston's blood ran cold. "Who's coming?" "The other one." A minute passed. 2. The silence stretched. Marston's senses were on fire. He heard nothing but the pounding of his own heart. Then, a sound. The crunch of boots on gravel, slow, deliberate. It was not Hesh's shambling gait. It was a measured, confident tread. The sound of a man who was used to walking on ground he owned. A sharp rap on the door. 3 times, the sound an executioner might make. Marston got to his feet. He moved Cinder behind him, a protective instinct he didn't know he still possessed. He walked to the door, his hand hovering over the latch. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice rough. A voice answered, smooth and cultured, a voice that belonged in a synod scriptorium, not the ass end of the Grieve. "A traveler, seeking water and a moment's rest from the sun. I was told a man named Keel lived here." Marston knew that voice. He had not heard it in 6 years, but he would have known it in the depths of hell. It was the voice that had chanted the litany of unburdening as Salt Ash Hollow burned. Praetor Valerius, his former commander. Marston's mind raced. How? How could they have found him? He had covered his tracks, changed his name, buried himself in this wasteland. He looked back at Cinder. The child was calm, their face a small, pale mask. The other one. They had known. He couldn't refuse. A lone ranch hand refusing a traveler water would be a question Hesh would ask. A loose thread Valerius would pull until his whole life unraveled. He drew the latch and opened the door. Valerius stood there, silhouetted against the rising sun. He was older, his hair streaked with gray at the temples, but he wore the same air of serene, unshakable authority. He was not in armor, but wore simple, expensive traveler's clothes. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were just as Marston remembered them, intelligent, amused, and utterly pitiless. They scanned the interior of the cabin, lingering for a fraction of a second on the small child half hidden behind Marston's legs. A flicker of surprise, nothing more. "Marston," Valerius said, a slow smile spreading across his face. He stepped inside, forcing Marston to back away. "It has been a long time. I almost didn't believe the whispers. A vexillator trading his shard for a shovel. Quite the fall from grace." "What do you want, Valerius?" Marston's voice was a low growl. I want to understand." Valerius's gaze drifted back to Cinder. "I see you've adopted the local customs. Who is this?" "My kin," Marston lied, the word tasting strange. "Kin?" Valerius raised an eyebrow. "You have no kin, Marston. The synod is your only family. You took an oath. Or have you forgotten that, along with your name?" Valerius walked around the small room, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He picked up the river stone from the shelf. He weighed it in his hand. "You always did have a weakness for sentiment, a flaw in an otherwise exemplary soldier." He put the stone down. "We have a problem, Marston. An old wound has reopened. There are whispers of a survivor from the salt ash purification, a child, one who is said to carry the memory of that night." Marston's heart felt like it had stopped. He kept his body still, a wall of flesh between Valerius and Cinder. "Superstition," Marston said, spitting the synod's own word back at him. "You taught us that." "I taught you to eradicate it," Valerius corrected smoothly. "But a persistent myth can be as dangerous as a truth. It inspires rebellion. It gives the desperate hope. The scriveners have decreed that this ghost must be laid to rest. Permanently. His eyes locked onto Marston's. I tracked the rumors here, to this desolate stretch of nothing. They spoke of a strange child appearing out of the earth. Imagine my surprise when the trail led me to my lost Vexellator. He smiled again, a predator's smile. You always were drawn to the kith's particular brand of filth, weren't you? Even at the end. I remember your hesitation. I remember you looking at that weaver. Cinder stepped out from behind Marston's legs. The child's face was serene. They looked directly at Valerius, their dark eyes holding his pale ones. I know you, Cinder said, their voice clear and steady. Valerius's smile faltered. He looked down at the child, a flicker of genuine unease in his expression. And who are you, little ghost? My mother was the weaver of the silver moth, Cinder said. You burned her loom. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy. Valerius stared at the child, his composure finally cracking. The pieces were slotting into place in his sharp, analytical mind. The survivor. The ghost. He had found them, and he had found them with the one man who had faltered during their extermination. Marston, Valerius said, his voice dropping, losing its silken edge, becoming hard as iron. You will stand aside. I will finish the work you failed to complete 6 years ago. I will unburden this remnant. He took a step forward. Marston didn't move. He just stood there, a mountain between the past and the present. He looked from the cold fury in Valerius's face to the quiet certainty in Cinder's. The child was not afraid. They were watching him, waiting for him to make a choice he should have made 6 years ago in the fire and the screaming. No, Marston said. It was the easiest word he had ever spoken. Valerius's hand went to his belt, to the long, thin blade he always carried, a duelist's weapon. Don't be a fool, Marston. You are a broken man hiding in a mud hut. I am a praetor of the unwritten law. Do you think you can stop me? I think, Marston said, his voice rumbling from deep in his chest. You are a long way from home, Valerius, and the ground here doesn't know your name. He moved. It was not the precise economical movement of a vexellator. It was the raw, explosive force of a man with nothing left to lose. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply launched himself at Valerius, his body a battering ram. The praetor was fast, his blade singing from its sheath, but Marston was bigger, stronger, fueled by 6 years of shame and a single night of revelation. He crashed into Valerius, sending them both stumbling backward, through the open doorway and out into the harsh morning light. They fell in a tangle of limbs. Valerius was skilled, trying to bring the point of his blade to bear, but Marston was on top of him, his hands grabbing for the praetor's throat. His fingers, thick with calluses, closed around Valerius's neck. Valerius's eyes widened, his face purpling. He dropped the blade, his hands clawing at Marston's wrists. Marston squeezed. He was not the Synod's instrument now. He was not a vexellator. He was just a man, and he was killing another man with his bare hands under the unforgiving desert sun. He could see the weaver of the silver moth. He could see Rorik. He could see the fire, and he squeezed harder, putting all the rage, all the guilt, all the pain of the last 6 years into that single, final act. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage. Valerius's body went limp beneath him. Marston stayed there for a long moment, kneeling over the dead man, his own ragged breaths loud in the sudden, profound silence. The sun was warm on his back. He looked at his hands, the hands that had buried a man 6 years ago and unearthed a child the night before. They were just hands. He stood up. He felt strangely calm. Empty. He turned and looked at the cabin. Cinder was standing in the doorway, watching him. Their expression was unchanged. Marston walked past them, back into the cabin. He went to the water barrel and washed his hands, scrubbing them until they were raw. He didn't look at Cinder. He couldn't. He picked up the folded shirt from the cot and his water skin. He walked back to the doorway. Hesh will come looking for him, Marston said, his voice flat. They'll send others from the Synod. You can't stay here. Cinder just looked at him. There are other kith, Marston said. He didn't know if it was true, but he needed it to be. In the mountains, to the south, the Synod is afraid of the high passes. You have to go there. You have to find them. He pushed the water skin into the child's hands. You follow the dry riverbed until it forks. You take the fork that smells of pine. You walk until you can walk no more, and then you keep walking. You don't stop. He was turning to leave, to deal with Valerius's body, to figure out what came next, when Cinder spoke. You have to close the hole first, the child said. Marston stopped. He turned back. What? The hole you dug, Cinder said, their gaze drifting toward the mesquite grove. It's open. It's not finished. A new kind of dread, colder and deeper than any before, settled over Marston. He looked from the child to the spot in the distance. He had to close it. Of course he did. He had to bury Valerius. He had to cover the shard. He had to erase the evidence. He picked up the spade he had left, leaning against the cabin wall. The wood felt cold in his hands. Stay here, he told Cinder. Don't come out. He walked to Valerius's body. He slung the dead praetor over his shoulder. The body was a dead weight, nothing like the lightness of the child. He carried it out toward the mesquite grove, his steps heavy. The sun was climbing higher, beating down on him. The hole was waiting for him, a dark, patient mouth. He dumped Valerius's body into the grave. It landed with a soft, unpleasant thud. Marston looked down. The praetor lay crumpled at the bottom, beside the vexillators' shard. The two pieces of his past, together in one grave. It was fitting. He raised the spade, ready to fill it in, ready to cover it all. But he stopped. The child's words echoed in his head. It's not finished. He wasn't burying his past. He was just hiding the bodies. The guilt would remain. The memory would remain. The Synod would keep hunting. Cinder would never be safe as long as the world remembered a vexillator named Marston Keel. There was only one way to truly close the hole. One way to finish it. He heard a small sound behind him and turned. Cinder had followed him. The child stood a few feet away, watching him, the water skin clutched in their hands. I told you to stay back, he said, his voice cracking. Cinder didn't answer. They just watched him, their old eyes full of a terrible, sad wisdom. And in that moment, Marston understood. He understood what the earth had told the child. He understood why they had been waiting for him in that specific place. The hole wasn't for the knife. It wasn't for Valerius. It had been dug for him, by him, an act of predestination. He looked at Cinder, and for the first time, he asked the question that had been burning in him from the beginning, the final, terrible question. Who was he? Marston asked, his voice barely a whisper. The Weaver, Rorik, who was he to you? Cinder's face for the first time showed a flicker of emotion, a deep, ancient grief that no child should ever know. He was my father, Cinder said. When he fell, my mother hid me in the kiln works, in the cold ash of the fire that had baked the story stones. She told me to wait. She said the man with the sad eyes would come back. She said you whispered my father's name like a prayer. She said you would dig my grave, but that it was meant for you. The truth landed, and it did not shatter him. It settled into place, a final, perfectly fitting stone in the mosaic of his ruin. The weaver's pity, the mother's promise, the child in the earth. It was all one story, his judgment. He looked down into the hole, at the dead praetor and the dark shard. Then he looked at the pile of earth beside it. He looked at the vast, indifferent desert sky. He had been running for 6 years, trying to bury a single moment. But you can't bury something that's still alive inside you. He turned to Cinder. He knelt down, so his eyes were level with theirs. You were right, he said. It isn't finished. He reached out and gently took the old riverstone from the child's pocket, where they must have put it. He held it in his palm. He could almost feel a faint vibration from it, like a distant, sorrowful song. "Go south," he said, his voice steady now, clear. "Find the kith. Show them this stone. Tell them Marston Keel has returned to the earth. Tell them the debt is paid." He pressed the stone into Cinder's hand and closed their small fingers around it. He stood up. He walked to the edge of the hole. He took off his worn coat and laid it on the ground. Then, with a strange sense of peace, of finality, he slid down into the grave. He lay down beside Valerius, his head pillowed on the cool, unforgiving dirt. He stretched out his legs, his body fitting neatly into the space he had dug. He folded his hands on his chest. From down here, the sky was just a perfect, sharp-edged rectangle of brilliant blue. He could smell the dust, the creosote, and the faint, metallic scent of the shard beside him. It felt right, inevitable. He looked up at the small silhouette of the child standing at the edge of the grave, looking down at him. They held the spade in their small hands. It was almost as tall as they were. "It's okay," Marston said, his voice calm. "You can do it. Close the hole." For a long moment, Cinder just stood there, the spade in their hands. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the child lifted the tool. It was too heavy, but they managed. They pushed a small cascade of dirt into the hole. It landed softly on Marston's chest. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't vengeful. It felt like a blanket. He did not close his eyes. He watched the rectangle of blue sky shrink as the child worked, their small form a determined shadow against the sun. He listened to the soft rhythm of the falling earth, the gentlest of drum beats, the sound of a story ending. The scent of the soil was rich and deep, the smell of forgetting and being forgotten. He thought of the weaver, Rorik, and the pity in his eyes. Maybe this was the mercy, not the severing of a soul, but the final, willing return to the dirt. The last spadeful of earth slid into place, and the world went dark. It was not a frightening darkness. It was quiet, and it was still, and it was, at long last, finished.